Guess what tonight is? The last night. Yes, there is a final exam, but it's going to be comprehensive. So I hope you kept up with Joshua all the way through Judges, and tonight we'll do Ruth. Now today we come to the conclusion of our study on the pre-kingdom history of Israel. I wish I had a better name for it, because people hear that in church and they're like, I don't want to go to the pre-kingdom history of Israel. It's got a real dry sound to it. But it's actually, to me, one of the more interesting parts of the history section of the Bible, because it takes us all the way from Moses all the way up to King Saul. And we began our study with Joshua, which picked up where Deuteronomy left off, and we continue with Judges, which picks up where Joshua leaves off, and now we come to Ruth, which interrupts the story began by Joshua and which continues in 1 Samuel. So if you're looking at the timeline, you've got everything up until this point. You've got from creation, and time's going right along, and then you get Abraham, and time goes right along, and then you have Moses and Joshua, and then you have the Judges, and then you have the Kings. That's the timeline, okay? It goes just like that. But Ruth just sticks in there and messes everything up. Ruth does not advance the story at all. Ruth is not part of the timeline, okay? Now, what does Ruth chapter 1, verse 1 say? Does anybody know? Do you remember? When does Ruth take place? Not sometime. That's right, when the judges ruled. That's exactly right, when the judges ruled. So we don't know exactly when in the judges' rule it took place, but we know that it took place during the time of the judges. All right? So since Ruth does not advance the storyline, which actually begins in Genesis and which ends in 2 Samuel, we want to ask a question. Why is Ruth included in the Bible? Why is Ruth included in the Bible? And to answer this question, I want to ask two more questions. Okay? Why is Ruth located where it is in the Bible, number one? Why is it located where it is? And number two, what purpose does it serve in that location? Now, I kind of gave y'all a little bit of a preview of this last week. But to begin our investigation, we want to look at where Ruth is located in the Bible. Now, we know that Ruth comes after Judges in the English Bible, and it's placed there for a very simple purpose. Ruth 1:1, during the days of the Judges. That's when Ruth's story occurs, so naturally it comes right after Judges. Now, in this location, Ruth provides a third snapshot of life under the Judges. Remember, in Judges 17 through 21, we have two snapshots of life under the Judges. Both are extremely negative. Both involve Levites, and both involve heinous sins. Remember the two sins? The Levite goes, and the man named Micah hires a Levite priest to be his own priest in a false religion. Tribe of Dan comes along, takes him, hires him to be the false priest of an entire tribe, and he leads Dan into false idolatry, and Dan eventually leads the northern kingdoms into false idolatry. So it was a terrible story. And then the other one, which I'm sure y'all remember quite well, the Levite's concubine runs away. He goes and gets her. He's traveling back through the territory of Benjamin, and the men try to sodomize him, and they give the concubine to the men, and they gang rape her, and they kill her through abuse, and he says, I want payback. So he gets all the tribes of Israel to fight against Benjamin, and 65,000 men die, and they nearly wipe out the tribe of Benjamin. So Ruth, on the other hand, is a third snapshot, but it provides a positive picture in many ways. Now, it's got some negatives in it too. you see some problems going on in Israel. It's not a profitable time. It's harsh life. And so that's negative. But it is positive in the story itself. It involves Judah. Every time Judah shows up to this point in Judges, and now in Ruth, when Judah shows up, good things happen. Remember, Othniel is the only judge from the tribe of Judah, and he's the ideal judge. Caleb is from the tribe of Judah, and he is the ideal Israelite. He says, I believe God, I believe His promises, I believe His power. Give me the hill country, and I'm going to take it for an inheritance. So Caleb's the ideal Israelite. So it involves Judah, and it involves great mercy and great grace. Thus, Ruth, firstly, is set as a counterpart to the ending of Judges. All right, so that's one reason that I believe it's in the story. I believe in the English Bible, which we have Joshua, Judges, Ruth, and then 1st and 2nd Samuel. All right, 1st and 2nd Samuel. That's the order. And then 1st and 2nd Kings, which takes us all the way through Israel's history. Those 5 books take us all the way through Israel's history. All right? But in this order, I believe one purpose of the book of Ruth is to be a counterpart to Judges. In other words, that's a not equal sign. I use that sometimes to mean the opposite of or different from. It's different from the 2 stories at the end of Judges. And secondly, it provides the birth line of King David. Who, of course, is in Jesus' birth line. Okay? Now, before I go any further, and I don't think it's in my notes, and I was trying to think ahead, I'm pulling to Brother John where my mind's working here and my mouth's working over here. I want to ask a question. If it's in there to be a counterpart to Judges, possibly, and to provide the genealogy of David, I'm going to ask again, why is Ruth in the Bible? Because guess what? This genealogy is an embarrassment. It's an embarrassment to David. Because who is David's great-grandmother in this genealogy? Who? Yes. And what is Ruth? That's right. So she is an enemy of Israel. She's despised by the Jews. And she's King David's grandmother, great-grandmother. All right? So you got you don't just have a woman being put into the line, which is highly unusual, but you now have a foreign woman. She's not even a Jew. And then not only is she not a Jew, but she's despised by the Jews as a Moabite woman. All right, so why? I wouldn't have put this in. I'm leaving Ruth out because this makes David look bad, and ultimately it kind of makes Jesus look bad from a human standpoint. All right, that being said, that's how you know Ruth belongs in the Bible, because it's telling something that is not complimentary, and it's including it, warts and all. You know, somebody said when the Bible paints a person's portrait, it does so warts and all. See, when kings used to have their portraits made and painted back in the old days, the artist would leave off the moles and the warts and paint them perfectly. Now, I don't know exactly why they did that, because you go look at the king and you see he's got a big wart, and then you go look at his picture and it's perfect. People knew, but they didn't want to see that wart on the picture. No, filters didn't start with Facebook. That's right. So, we don't. Yeah, that's right. But this is included in the Bible, and the Jew who included this in the Bible, that wrote the book, said, I'm going to tell the truth. So the genealogy is there partly as evidence that the Bible is true, partly to offset the Judges' snapshot at the end of Judges, and to give the genealogy of King David and prepare us for King David. But the problem is, in its current placement, there are two unexpected interruptions in preparing the reader for the arrival of King David. Okay, so you got Ruth, it ends with David, and you're expecting David in the next story, right? But it's not David. David doesn't appear next, the final judge does in Samuel. And who is the final judge in the line of Judges? Not Samson. Samson is the last one in the book of Judges, but there's one more judge that's named by name. And he comes after Samson, and he's after Samson and before King Saul. So who is the last judge in the Bible? It's Samuel. Samuel is the last judge mentioned. In those days, Samuel judged Israel. Okay? So, David appears, and then he just fades out of the storyline. The next story is about Samuel, and then David is not the first king that we would expect. It's Saul. So you have Joshua judges Ruth. We have a story about David's genealogy. We expect David, and we get Samuel and Saul. You don't get David till way into the story. So if Ruth is to give the genealogy and prepares for David, it's again a weird thing, because the genealogy, first of all, is an embarrassment to David, and second of all, David doesn't show up until 13 chapters later. So it's weird that it's serving that function. It doesn't do a very good job. So the storyline is strained to some degree. But if Judges were to go directly into 1 Samuel, we would see life go directly from the first 12 judges to the 13th judge, Samuel. So while it seems logical to place Ruth after Judges to provide a third snapshot of life under the Judges, we can see some literary problems. Now, I'm looking at this as an English major. Okay, I'm not looking at this from a theological perspective right now. That's not what I'm doing. I'm saying if we're looking at this as a book, and we're reading the story, and we've been going straight line from creation in Adam up to Abraham to Moses and Joshua, then to the Judges, and we're getting ready for the Kings, we ought to expect this to continue. But for the first time, we have this mess interrupting the literary progress of our story. Okay? So, literarily, Ruth is out of place in this arrangement. All right? But there's another option. Now, I'm going to come back to this in a moment. I know I'm criticizing it looks like the Bible. I'm not. I said I'm doing this literarily. There's theology that puts it here. Okay? But we'll talk about that in a minute. There's another option that's available, though, that we need to consider, and that's the placement of Ruth in the Hebrew Bible as the Jews have known it for thousands of years, or at least for several hundred years, and well, yeah, literally a couple thousand years at least. Ruth is the first book of, and it's a Hebrew word, and it's weird to do in English, but I'm going to try. The Megaloth. That's not how you say it in Hebrew, and it's hard to say it in English when you know the letters. But it's the Megaloth, or Megalote. The H, there's some pronunciation difference between modern Hebrew and biblical Hebrew. Megaloth, all right? And this collection of books, known as the Megaloth, is 5 books, okay? And the 5 books are Ruth, Song of Solomon, Ecclesiastes, Lamentations, and Esther. Now, I wrote it in that chiastic structure for a reason. I wrote it in that for a reason. All right, so that's the 5 books. That is the Megilloth. Now, I know you won't know what Megilloth means, so I'll tell you. It means small scrolls. All right? All of these books are very short. Ecclesiastes is the longest one, but they're very short. And they were read at 5 Jewish festivals. Ruth was read at Pentecost. I can't remember where the other ones were read. Oh, the Lamentations was read at the in memory of the destruction of the temple in 586 and AD 70. So they had these festivals, and they would read the entire book at these festivals. And Ruth was read at the festival of Pentecost. Now, the order of the books is not without significance. The Jews very carefully arranged the Megilloth. How many people know what the minor prophets are? Just nod or okay, we got a couple nod. We got some nod. All right, the minor prophets are 12 books at the end of the English Bible, Old Testament. There are 12 books. Do you realize those 12 books are always grouped together in the scrolls? They're always grouped together in the scrolls. And they actually tell a theological story in order. And Habakkuk is the center point of the minor prophets. It's called the Book of the 12 in the Hebrew Bible. And when you get to Habakkuk 2:4, you come to the center point of the 12, theologically speaking. Now, why is Habakkuk 2:4 important? Yeah, go ahead, Mary Jo. You know what it is. What is it? Yes. I almost think it's quoted in Romans, Galatians, and Hebrews. The just shall live by faith. Paul quotes it twice, and Hebrews quotes it once. So that passage is taken out of the book of the 12, and it's the turning point of the 12, and people look at Romans, Galatians, and Hebrews, and they say this is what the verse means, and they never look at it in its context in the book of the 12. You got to understand what function it had in the book of the 12 before you can understand it in Romans, Galatians, and Hebrews. All right, Ruth, the book of the 12, the Megilloth is exactly the same. It's arranged in a particular order to tell a particular story. And in a chiasm, all right, a chiasm is like you got here. All right, you got number 1, number 2, then you got the center point, then you got 2 prime, that's the way you mark it, and then you got 1 prime. And 1 prime goes with 1, 2 prime goes with 2, and the center point is the whole point of the chiasm. Okay? So when you get to the center point, then you have reached the meaning of the book, and it's going to lead up to it, and it's going to lead out of it. This is leading up to the message. This is explaining the message. That's the way a chiasm works. Okay? Now, the Jews, when they arranged the Megilloth, they did it for a reason. All right? The last book before the Megilloth, is Proverbs in the Hebrew Bible. So you got Proverbs, then you got the Megilloth. All right? Why is that interesting? If Proverbs and then Ruth. Somebody tell me, just think for a second. How does Proverbs end? The virtuous woman or the noble wife. What is Ruth? Well, she's a virtuous woman, right? Yeah, she's the ideal woman in the Bible. Ruth does everything right. Proverbs 31 ends with the virtuous woman, and then the very first book to follow it is an example of the virtuous woman. All right? So Ruth is possibly listed next to illustrate the example par excellence of the virtuous woman. And as such, she is proudly included in David's lineage. She's not a Moabite. She's a virtuous woman. She's not a Moabite. She is the virtuous woman of Proverbs 31. You see what I'm saying? So it gives Ruth a slightly different lens to be viewed through. You think I'm telling you the story about a Moabite. No, I'm not. I'm telling you a story about the virtuous woman. You see what I'm saying? So that placement is not without purpose to put the Megillah after Proverbs, and Ruth being the first book in the Megillah. All right. Secondly, Ruth, Song of Solomon, Ecclesiastes, Lamentations, and Esther form one coherent unit. Ruth and Esther go together as bookends. Now, there's only two books of the Bible named after women, and they're right there on the board. Ruth and Esther. And they're both in the same collection of books, and they're on the start and the finish. Do you think that's coincidence? That they're in the same collection. One starts the collection, one ends the collection. You're starting to see this isn't an accident, okay? All right? And Ruth and Esther go together. Song of Solomon and Lamentations. Now, what's Song of Solomon? Just in general, it's a happy poem for the most part, right? It's happy. It's a love story between a husband and wife. There's some ups and downs in it, but yay, it ends on a high note. Okay? What's Lamentations? It's a poem, just like Song of Solomon, but I'll give you a hint, the name. It's a lament. It's 5 laments that have no happy ending. It is just a man pouring his heart out to God, and believe me, if you read Lamentations, it's written by Jeremiah, the weeping prophet, and it will make you weep. Lamentations is agony in poetic form, okay? And then Ecclesiastes is the centerpiece of the collection. It doesn't have a counterpart to it. So let's consider the relationship of Ruth to the Megillah, and we may find a purpose for the book being included in the Bible. As we just noted, Ruth and Esther form the bookends of the Megillah. This is not coincidental. As I mentioned a moment ago, they're the only 2 books of the Bible named after women. They're the only 2 books where women are the heroes of the book. Think about that. It's just not that the book's named after them. It's not just that they're included as part of the story. They are the story. All right? They are the heroes. They both represent the virtuous woman of Proverbs 31, but from 2 very different perspectives. Ruth is a rural story. It's told in the farmland country. Where's Esther told? In the palace. That's right, in the metropolis, okay? Ruth is a despised foreigner. Esther is an elite Jew. Ruth is married to a Jew. Esther is married to a foreigner. Okay? So there's some pretty big differences. But there's also some similarities. Ruth and Esther both live under oppression. Ruth is oppressed by the famine, and Esther is oppressed by the Persians. And Ruth and Esther both save a family. Ruth saves her husband's name and blesses him with a family, and Esther saves her uncle and the entire Jewish nation. Okay, so they both do that. Now, what do these contrasts and comparisons mean for interpreting the book of Ruth? Well, the book comes immediately after Proverbs 31's virtuous woman, and so as I stated earlier, one possible purpose is to illustrate the virtuous woman. So we're going to put a purpose here, and I'm going to, where did I do my eraser? Here it is. we're going to erase this so I can get some more room up here. All right, so in the Hebrew Bible, one of the purposes may be to illustrate the virtuous woman of Proverbs 31. That's one possible reason, okay, for it being in the Bible. Esther would do the same from another perspective. The virtuous woman in a completely different situation. But Ruth also comes before the Song of Solomon. All right? We go from the rural life of the virtuous woman Ruth to the story of the perfect husband-wife relationship. This story is so perfect that most commentators say it's a picture of Jesus and what? The church. You get that all the time. Or God and Israel. It's such a perfect relationship that people say this is a picture of God and Israel or Jesus and the church. Okay? It may be in some way, but I don't take it that way. I take this for what it is. It is a highly charged poem that is about a husband and wife at a literary level. Now, there's some theology behind it, but I'm saying if I took this poem out of the Bible and I put it in Norton's Anthology of English Literature, and you were to read the Song of Solomon, Jesus and the church and God and Israel would not come to your mind from a literary standpoint. Okay? It just wouldn't. You would think this is a poem about a husband and wife and their ups and downs. Okay? So, Ruth ends on a high note. Song of Solomon ends on a high note. Ruth represents the quintessential love story, and Song of Solomon represents the quintessential love poem. You see how this is structured and glued together now? All right? So Song of Solomon's mirror in the Megillot is Lamentations. So you got Song of Solomon and Lamentations. They're on the same level. Okay? Song of Solomon and Lamentations. And Lamentations is the mirror of Song of Solomon. Both are a collection of poems. Song of Solomon is upbeat and a positive poem detailing the marriage covenant relationship between Solomon and his wife. Lamentations is a sad and negative poem detailing the marriage covenant relationship between God and Israel. The endings of each are also symmetrical. Song of Solomon ends with a longing for the precious relationship with his wife and her for her husband. In other words, honey, I can't live without you. Okay? Lamentations ends with a longing for the restoration of the covenant relationship between God and Israel. And at the center of the Megillot is Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes is not a story. We got a story and a story. Matter of fact, let me write it up here like this. We got a story and we got a story. We got a poem and we got a poem. And right in the center, we've got something that is neither a story nor a poem. Right? We've got something that's neither a story or a poem. Ecclesiastes is not a story like Ruth and Esther. It's not a poem like Song of Solomon and Lamentations. It is what? Mary Jo, you're about to bust back there. What is it? Yes, it's a wisdom literature. It's wisdom literature. So Song of Solomon, Ecclesiastes is wisdom literature. It's not a story and it's not a poem. It's a collection of thoughts observed from the natural world and drawing a theology out of the natural world based on your observations. What does he keep saying? Oh, I have seen everything under the sun. I have seen the way of a man. I've seen. And vanity of vanities, all is vanity. All right, so Ecclesiastes is Solomon looking at the world with his own two eyes and observing it and drawing some conclusions from his observations. All right? Now, as wisdom literature, as I've just hinted at, it's not absolute truth with a capital T. Wisdom literature is not absolute truth with a capital T. It's general truths. Train up a child in the way he should go. When he's old, he'll not depart from it. Oh, yeah, really? Generally, that's true. But it's not absolute truth with a capital T. Because a lot of people raise their kids up in the church with the Bible, doing devotions, and when the child goes off to college, he loses his mind. And sometimes they never come back. Okay? So it's not an absolute truth. If that's an absolute truth, the Bible has a flaw in it. It has an error in it, because we all know of people that have gone off the wrong direction even though they were raised in a godly home. All right, so it's a general truth. And the ultimate conclusion of Ecclesiastes and the heart of the megalote is found in Ecclesiastes 12, 13, and 14. Turn to Ecclesiastes 12. Ecclesiastes is hiding from you. There it is. Ecclesiastes 12, verse 13 and 14. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. You couldn't miss it if you wanted to. He's saying, hey, here's the message. Fear God and keep His commandments. Now, if you were in Sunday school this morning in men's class, this is what we were driving home. Fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God shall bring every work into judgment with every secret thing, whether it be good or whether it be evil. That is the message of Ecclesiastes. And it's a key for it is the key for understanding the message of the megalote and for understanding the purpose of Ruth. If the megalote's message is fear God and keep His commandments, then Ruth and Esther must serve to illustrate this in story form. Does that make sense? If whatever the heart of the chiastic structure is, the message of the center point is illustrated by what leads to it and what leads away from it. All right? So, with the wisdom literature, Ecclesiastes, for it's fear God and keep His commandments. All right? That's the message. That's the message of the heart of the megalote. So Esther and Ruth have to illustrate that in story form. All right? Furthermore, Ecclesiastes 12:14, the admonition there that God will bring every work into judgment is clearly illustrated in these two stories. Ruth feared God, didn't she? And she kept His commandments. Your God shall be my God, she said to Naomi, and she fully converted to Judaism, and she fully followed the law. Okay? So she feared God and she kept His commandments. What about Esther? Did she fear God and keep His commandments? Absolutely. Ruth's private good actions, Ruth did this in private, remember? They were rewarded. So too were Esther's public actions rewarded. She went in before the king and told the king, hey, you got to save my people because you got this evil guy over here trying to wipe them out. All right? And the negative actions of the wicked characters are punished. In Ruth, the husbands die implicitly for leaving the land of Israel and for taking foreign wives. Were they supposed to leave the land of Israel? No. Did they leave the land? And what did they do while they were down in Moabite territory? They married Moabite women. And guess what happens to them? They died. Yeah, okay. In Esther, Haman is hanged on his own gallows. Okay? All right, so a second purpose, if Ecclesiastes 12:13 is taken as the center of the megalote, is found in God's providence. Here's the interesting thing about the megalote. God is rarely mentioned in the Megillah at all. And not at all, not even once, in the book of Esther. And only once by an allusion in the Song of Solomon. So, if the book is about God's providence, don't you think it's weird that in 2 of the books he's only mentioned one time, and Ruth he's mentioned a few times. Lamentations, he's the object of the conversation, and Ecclesiastes, vanity of vanities, until you get to the last 2 verses and it turns everything on its head. God is not mentioned very much in the Megillah. All right? But his guiding hand is clearly seen. He's the one who orchestrates all the events of the Ruth and Esther stories. When you read Ruth and Esther, do you think it's coincidence that these favorable things happen to these 2 godly women, to the virtuous woman? Or do you think they're being shown favor by God and their steps are being directed by God himself? Of course, you can see God's directing their steps. So I would offer 2 purposes for the book of Ruth as it's placed in the Hebrew Bible. Number 1, to illustrate the virtuous woman of Proverbs 31. And 2, I would say it is this. Number 2 is to illustrate in story form Ecclesiastes 12:13 and 14 in story form. Okay? In conjunction with Esther. You can't separate Ruth from Esther in the Hebrew Bible, and they both have the same message. The virtuous woman illustrates the truth of Ecclesiastes 12:13 and 14. That's what Ruth does in the Hebrew Bible. In the English Bible, it's to illustrate life under the judges and to begin to prepare the reader for the coming of King David, who is an unlikely hero due to his lineage. When you find out that Ruth is King David's great-grandmother, and you're reading that in the book, do you expect great things from David, this grandson of a Moabite woman? Right, I mean, right, if you don't know, if you're just reading this as literature, take the story out of the Bible, put it in an anthology of English literature. You're not looking for big things from David. David is kind of going down, 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 down. Oh, he's down here somewhere. All right? But if you read the story as the virtuous woman and you get David's lineage, you're starting to expect great things from David. But David in the English Bible is an unlikely hero. And when he finally shows up, what is little David doing? Taking care of the sheep. That's right, and going to bring food to his brothers in the battle. So little David, who is the great-grandson of a Moabite woman, is tending sheep, and he's nothing to look at. He's a little guy. Saul's a great big guy. David's average at best because the Bible doesn't say anything great about his appearance. It said he's ruddy-cheeked. He's a youthful-looking boy. Saul is Arnold Schwarzenegger. Literally. Yeah, he was tall, and he looked like a king. So David comes from an unlikely person and has an unlikely job to turn out to be a hero. So the English Bible prepares us for a twist. The Hebrew Bible prepares us for what? Yeah, it's God's plan, and it shows us the Ecclesiastes 12:13 and 14 in story form. Fear God and keep his commandments, as the virtuous woman, in fact, does. All right, now, I pray that this helps you understand the book of Ruth better than ever before. And to see it as more than a love story. All right, we all have read Ruth as a love story. But what if it's not really a love story at all, when you get underneath the skin of it? What if it's something more? It is a multi-purpose book that illustrates the truth of Solomon's wisdom, fear God and keep his commandments. And this same truth, here's where it hits home, applies to us today. The love story doesn't apply to us. If you read Ruth's history, me and Cleburne and Michael and Brother John and Chad, we're left out. I mean, we are. We're not running around trying to marry the next guy to take care of us. So if it's a love story, we're left out. But if it's a story of fear God and keep his commandments, even the men who are here can learn a lesson from it. Even the men who are here can learn a lesson from it. The virtuous woman sets up an example for men and women of how to fear God and keep his commandments. And so do the poems, and the Ecclesiastes, of course, brings the message home in a clear statement. All right? So I hope you see it's more than a love story. I hope you see it's a multi-purpose book. I hope you see it illustrates the heart of Solomon's wisdom, fear God and keep his commandments. And I hope you see this truth applies to us today. And I hope that if you've never done it before, you'll take that message to heart and understand God's going to judge you for every work that you do, both good and bad. He did it in Ruth, he did it in Esther, and he'll do it in your life as well. Thank y'all for coming.